John and Sandra were a perfect couple and were looking forward to sharing the rest of their lives together. When they unexpectedly became pregnant with triplets, they knew their lives were about to completely change. However, things soon took a different turn than expected. After many secrets and fights, John leaves Sandra and the children and does not see any of them again until years later, and he's completely shocked when he realizes the truth. John was beginning to have serious doubts about his family. He couldn't ignore the fact that his children were nothing like him. When he confronts his wife about it, she denies everything, so John decides to take matters into his own hands and do a DNA test. When he hears the results, his world falls apart. The DNA test shows that he is not the father of the triplets, and since his wife continues to deny cheating, he decides to leave her. He loves her, but he can't be with someone who isn't honest with him. He doesn't hear anything from Sandra or her children for years, but he never forgets the triplets. Even though his time with them was short, they were sweet, and he would remember them for the rest of his life. One day, he sees them again and discovers something that turns his entire world upside down. What happened when John saw the triplets again? What did he discover? John and Sandra had been married for a couple of years when they discovered she was pregnant. They were both delighted to hear this news. They talked about having children before, and although they hadn't planned to become parents yet, they were over the moon. It was going to completely change their lives, but not in the way they thought it would. Their relationship was already pretty good, but during pregnancy it even got better. They grew closer, learning more about each other and themselves, and they both took great care of each other. They had really enjoyed their life together so far and were eager to expand their family. When they heard they were having triplets, at first they were completely shocked. They hadn't planned a single baby yet, and suddenly they were going to have 3. They were also a little worried because neither of them had raised a baby before, but soon all their worries faded away. After the first echo where they'd seen the babies' faces on the screen, they'd already fallen completely in love. They knew they were going to do whatever it took to provide these babies with a loving and caring home. At this point, they still had no idea how their lives were about to change. As the pregnancy progressed, they converted a spare room in their house into a daycare. They really enjoyed picking out all the furniture and buying clothes and other things for their babies. They could never have imagined that such a beautiful moment in their lives would end the way it did. 9 months passed before they knew it. One day, Sandra's water broke and John quickly took her to the hospital. That same day, 3 beautiful babies were born. Everyone was perfectly healthy and Sandra's recovery was going well too. Everything seemed to be perfect, but that was about to change. The new parents were adjusting to their new life with 3 babies at home. They were doing a good job and quickly got used to their new lifestyle. Both John and Sandra loved their children with all their hearts, but then John began to notice something he couldn't ignore. The babies looked nothing like him. He tried to convince himself that they were still too young, and once they grew a little older and their facial features developed even more, he could see the resemblance. But much to his disappointment, that just didn't happen. He wasn't sure what to do. He didn't want to do anything serious before he was absolutely sure his doubts were correct. He decided to talk to Sandra about it first. Yes, she was excited and tired, and it wasn't going to be a fun conversation, but he just needed to ask. It was the right thing. One night, after the babies had been put to bed, John sat next to Sandra and asked if they could talk. He explained what had been on his mind, and once he finished speaking, they sat there in silence for a few minutes. He had no idea how she was going to react. But when he finally looked at it, it was clear. She was furious. She asked John if he was serious, and he said he was. She completely exploded in anger. She couldn't believe he actually doubted her. What was he thinking? She stormed into the bedroom and slammed the door behind her. John was left alone in the living room, and although he felt bad for hurting his wife, he realized she had never denied what he'd said. Why hadn't she responded? Her question? It was obvious she was upset, but she might have more reasons. Even after he asked her, she'd never explicitly told him her babies were his as much as hers, and this only raised more questions in John's mind. He knew he had to do something, although his wife wouldn't be much help. He thought about it for a moment and decided the best thing to do was a DNA test. This would definitely give him a clear answer to his questions, so he made an appointment with his doctor and explained the situation. He knew he had to be careful because if Sandra knew what he was doing, she would only get angrier. John waited until Sandra went to take a shower and secretly collected everything the doctor would need to do the DNA test. He used cheek swabs to collect each of the baby's DNA and used the room for himself. Now he was one step closer to finding the truth. The next day, he delivered all the DNA samples to the lab. The only thing he could do now was wait for the doctor to call back with the results, and John hated waiting. He still had no idea what to expect, but they hoped he would be related. Days passed and he barely spoke to his wife. They only talked when they had to talk about their children, like feeding them or changing their diapers. John felt that something had changed in their relationship since he'd asked the question, and he was almost starting to regret it. These days were the most difficult for him. Every time he looked at his children, he couldn't help but think about the test and what would happen if his suspicions were confirmed. He loved them with all his heart, and it pained him to think of the possibility that it wasn't their father. One day, John's phone finally rang. It was the doctor. He quickly locked himself in the bathroom and held his breath while he answered the phone. He was so curious about what the doctor had to say that he couldn't wait to hear it. These next moments were to determine the rest of his life. "Hello, John, it's Dr. Roberts. Do you have a minute?" the doctor asked. John's heart was pounding in his chest and his hands were shaking as he listened to the voice coming through the phone, and then the doctor finally told him what the test results had shown him. The test showed that John was not the father. He was not related to babies in any way. Hearing this, his world collapsed. All this time he had hoped that his suspicions were wrong and that he was just imagining things, but now he discovered the truth. There was nothing he could do anymore. He was heartbroken. How could Sandra have done this to him? He thought she loved him. Their relationship had always been perfect. They never fought and completely trusted each other, but maybe that had been his mistake. About a year ago, he'd noticed she'd become very close to one of his colleagues. Could it be something to do with this? John decided to confront Sandra about it. He hoped she would be honest with him now and give him the answers he asked for. Now that he had real proof, she would have to admit what she'd done behind his back, right? However, Sandra continued to deny everything. She told him that she would never be unfaithful to him and that she would never do something like that to her family. John tried to get to admit it several times, but she stuck with her answer, and for John it was clear, Sandra could lie, but the DNA couldn't. A few months later, the divorce was finalized. John had left Sandra and the triplets, and although it hurt him, he thought he'd made the right decision. He still loved the triplets and would until the day he died, but he wasn't ready to start a family with the woman he loved after she'd betrayed him like that. For John, the worst part was that Sandra never admitted what she'd done. She continued denying everything until the end, and she begged John to stay, but he refused. If she'd been honest with him and willing to talk about it, he might have stayed even if he wasn't the father, but unfortunately that never happened. So they continued their lives without each other. John moved to an apartment in the city and Sandra stayed at home with her children. Years passed and they never heard from each other again until one day, and it was very different from what they expected. It was only years later that John would see the triplets again, and their meeting would lead to a surprising discovery. But until then, he thought about them all the time. Not a day went by without him looking at their photos or thinking about some special moments he shared with them. Sure, he only knew them when they were babies, but he'd still formed a connection with them, and he'd never forgive Sandra for betraying him like that, starting such a beautiful family with him and then taking it all away from him again. All of this kept going through his head, and it had a big impact on him. The more time passed, the worse John felt. Sandra had begged him to come back, and deep down he knew that he would have done exactly that if she had admitted what she did and told him the truth. But she kept insisting she'd never cheated on him, and since he no longer wanted to hear those lies, he cut off all contact. It only brought him more pain because he had not only lost his children but the love of his life. John began to fall into some bad habits and began drinking more than he should. But he soon realized he really needed to change things. If he ever wanted to be a father in the future, he needed to do better. He knew it was going to be a difficult road to recovery, but he wouldn't have to do it alone, and he would receive support from people he never expected to talk to. John was planning to go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, but before he could do so, someone unexpectedly showed up at his door. When he opened the door, he saw it was Sandra. She looked horrible, like she'd been crying a lot. John was a little embarrassed by the mess in his apartment, but he invited her in anyway. He wouldn't just slam the door in her face like that, and he was very surprised to see her. He never expected she'd want to see him again. If she showed up at his door like that, she really had to have important news, he thought. She walked in and sat at the chair at the kitchen table. She looked at him and tears were streaming down her face. "John, I don't know where to start," she whispered and held her head in her hands. John sat next to her and took her hand in his, trying to calm her down. He gave her a glass of water and she took a few deep breaths before starting to speak. "I know we haven't talked in a long time and I'm sorry for showing up unannounced, but I really need to tell you something. I still can't believe it myself." John just nodded, silently waiting for her to continue. He was curious about what she'd come to tell him. It seemed like she'd come to talk to him about the triplets. He still cared about him, even though he wasn't their father. Was everything okay with them, or did something happen? They were sick, or did they need money? He chuckled at that last thought. If that were the case, he wouldn't be able to help him anyway. But his serious face soon returned. He knew whatever it was, it had to be important. Sandra finally told him the real reason, and he turned pale. He didn't say or do anything, he just froze and looked into the distance. He repeated the words she'd just said inside his head until they lost all meaning. "You're kidding me, right? This had to be some kind of horrible joke." But Sandra looked at him and shook her head. "I'm serious. I'm so sorry, John. I also have no idea how this could have happened, but it's true." John realized she was telling the truth and he didn't know how to feel. He didn't know if he wanted to laugh or cry, so he did both. He didn't know if he wanted to be happy or angry with Sandra, but he just hugged her. This can't have been easy for her either. "Where do we have to go now?" he asked her, and she told him that someone was waiting for them at the police station. They got into her car as fast as they could and she took them to the station. When they got there, Sandra approached the receptionist and asked about Detective Cooper. "Mr. Cooper, thank you very much for meeting with me again. This is John, my ex-husband." The two men greeted each other and the three sat at Mr. Cooper's desk. He took a folder out of a drawer and placed it on the table. When Sandra opened the folder and looked inside, she said to John, "I haven't seen this yet. I wanted to do it together with you." He nodded and she took something out of the folder. When she placed it on the table, she realized it was a stack of photos. They looked through the pile and at first John didn't know what he was looking at. And all of the photos were of people who didn't appear to be aware of the fact they were being photographed. Why was he being shown this? Who are these people? But as they looked more at the pictures, John saw it, and once he'd seen it, he couldn't unsee it. He gasped and held his hand in front of his mouth. How? He wanted to ask so many questions but couldn't finish any of them. Sandra simply took his hand and nodded, and John burst into tears. What are we gonna do now? We can't just walk up to them and tell them what happened, right? Sandra responded, I don't know, that's why I brought you here. Once I discovered the truth, I contacted Mr. Cooper and asked him to track them down. I wanted to see how they were doing before I did something I could never get back. I thought it'd be easier once I saw the photos, but I still don't know what to do. At least now you know that I've always been honest with you. She looked at him with tears in her eyes, and John suddenly felt very sorry for her. He just realized what kind of horrible time he must have gone through and she must have gone through and felt guilty, but he'd deal with that later. You see, Sandra had made a shocking discovery. After John took that DNA test and it showed negative results, she insisted he take another, and he did, and it showed negative. John was furious and left her, but she didn't understand what was happening. She realized there must have been an error in the lab or that the test had been carried out incorrectly. But their relationship had been in ruins anyway, and John didn't believe her, so she decided to let him go. Until years later, she began to have doubts. As the years went by, Sandra began to notice something about the triplets. They didn't look anything like John, but they didn't look anything like her either. And once she realized this, she just couldn't let it go. She was determined to find out what was going on, so she did another DNA test, but with her own. And when Sandra saw the results of those tests, she finally realized what had happened. She called Mr. Cooper for help just to be sure, and the moment she saw the photos he'd shown her and John, she realized it wasn't just a crazy dream, it was a nightmare. It was true that she'd never cheated on John, and it was also true he wasn't the father of the triplets. In fact, she wasn't their mother. There was only one explanation for all this, and Mr. Cooper discovered it. The triplets had been switched with other triplets at the hospital when they were babies right after they were born. She was heartbroken when she found out, and she knew she had to tell John right away, and they had to make a difficult decision. Would they tell their own children about this or not? They deserved to know, but how much good would this do them? In an attempt to make this decision easier, Sandra had asked Mr. Cooper to find her triplets. She wanted to know how they looked and how they were doing. These triplets looked like exact copies of Sandra and John. It was kind of fun to see. They all seemed perfectly happy and healthy and completely unaware of the fact they never met their parents. So should they drop that bomb on their lives or let them live in peace? Sandra and John decided to take some time to think about this. Now that they knew what had really happened, they had a lot of things to talk about. Over time, they would mend their relationship and make a decision they both agreed on. They decided between telling the triplets the truth and keeping them safe from it. The most important thing at that moment was that they at least had each other again, and they would now get through this together.